So just quickly checking if we still have people stuck in the waiting room. Give us another minute or so, and then we are ready to get started. Okay, so welcome everybody to our last seminar this term. I have this Hawaiian background because I'm one of the last people between you and your summer vacation. Thank you for making it today. I am very excited about today's talk because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And we have a great speaker today. So I'd like to welcome John Fink, who is a professor of geology at PSU and a visiting professor of urban analytics at the University of British Columbia. Many of you know him through his service to PSU, among other things, as the first vice president of research. And currently he is leading PSU's Digital City Testbed Center and co-directs the Cascadia Urban Analytics Cooperative. And so if there's anybody at PSU who we should be listening to when we talk about brilliant cities, it's definitely Dr. Fink, and I'm really, really happy that he's here today. Thank you, John, for making it.
Thanks, Anthony. It's very nice to be here. I've appreciated listening in on the earlier talks in this series, and happy to be presenting today. So what I'd like to do today is to tell you about our Digital City Testbed Center, which was set up about 1.5 years ago, along with the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative, the other new center that was set up. So I'm going to run through a series of slides and tell you about what we're doing. To start off, I want to just talk a little bit about what we mean by smart cities, digital cities, and then talk about how we can use campuses to evaluate some of those, some of the options. And, oops, sorry. So basically what we're talking about here is using technology to improve how cities function, both for the people who live in them and the people who run them. And there are all kinds of positive reasons one would want to bring technology into cities. They can improve the operations, they can save money, they can provide more access to people of different types. They can provide more opportunities, economic opportunities, social opportunities. They can lead to better health outcomes, which is something that we're all very concerned with today. They can also have environmental benefits like reducing carbon emissions. But there are also concerns and less positive aspects of bringing technology into cities. Oops. So there's a series of risks that we could worry about. So the security of the data sets that are collected, who controls those, who owns those? What are the ethics associated with some of the technologies, like if there are cameras that are set up in a city, who gets to decide where those go and what's done with that information? Again, this is a topic that's in the news quite frequently. There are equity issues. If the technology is available to some people but not to others, is that fair? And does it require somebody to have a certain quality of technology personally to be able to take advantage of the opportunities? There's also questions of monopolization. If you have one company that has a contract with the city to basically do everything, does that then block the possibilities for startup companies to get involved? And we've seen examples of this many places, most recently the case of Toronto, which had a contract with Sidewalk Labs, which is related to Google, and there was a lot of pushback because people didn't want one company to have access to all of the data. And that contract actually ended a few weeks ago. And then there are issues about incompatibility. If we have lots of different companies that are deploying what they do in a city, can those talk to each other? And this is incompatibility issue and interoperability is something that the Digital City Testbed Center is paying particular attention to. So all of these all of these issues, the positives and the negatives, can be summarized in these 3 questions or these 3 challenges. First, how do the cities themselves evaluate all of the options that they're facing? Second, how does the public decide which of these options they would like? And how do they even make that decision? And third, how do the companies that are providing these opportunities, how do they align their products with what the city needs and what the people want? So all of these groups and all the groups that have these questions can benefit if the technology can be tested. And so what the Digital City Testbed Center is saying is that one of the ways to test technology is to do it on campuses before we subject all of the people in a city or all of the companies in a business district to some new innovation. Let's try it under more controlled conditions. And what we're saying is those controlled conditions exist quite nicely on campuses, university campuses, nonprofit campuses, hospitals, government offices, and corporate campuses. And so what we've done with the Digital City Testbed Center is to set up a network of campus testbeds. We have, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the advancement here. So we have 5 campuses that we're working with. 3 of them are shown on this slide. So the one on the left is Portland State University, which most of the people on this call are familiar with. Portland State is about 55 acres. The university is completely immersed in downtown Portland. In most parts of campus, if you're on the street, it's hard to tell if you're on the campus or off the campus. The second test bed in the upper right is the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, just across the river from PSU. That's a smaller campus. It's about 18 acres. And today, the 18 acres is broken up. 7 of the acres are the Science Museum, and 11 of the acres are parking lots. But there are plans to develop the parking lots into a very large commercial and residential mixed-use development over the next 5 to 10 years. And so part of the reason that we chose that site as a test bed is not just for what can be done today at the museum, but what can be built into the new development that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. And in the end of the talk, I'll get to a little bit more about that. And then the third campus that we're working with in the lower right is the University of British Columbia outside of Vancouver, BC. So in the slide, in the photo, way in the back is downtown Vancouver. And about 10 miles west of downtown is this peninsula where UBC is located. And as you can see, it's a self-contained city. It's actually separated from the suburbs of Vancouver by a half-mile wide, relatively pristine forest. It's quite an ideal place to do evaluation of technology because the university controls virtually all aspects of the operations of that campus. So we currently have these first 3 test beds, Portland State, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and the University of British Columbia. This year, we've added the University of Washington Seattle campus and also Portland International Airport. And then we're talking with groups at Microsoft, the Oregon Health and Science University, and the Oregon Zoo about having them be part of the network going forward. So the rationale behind the Digital City Testbed Center is first, we want to test the technology before it's deployed. Figure out what the problems are before you're subjecting thousands or millions of people to what these technologies might do. We also are partnering with cities. We're partnering with, in particular with the city of Portland, but also with the city of Vancouver and to a lesser extent with the city of Seattle, because we don't want to be coming up with ideas that are only of academic interest. We really want ideas that come from the cities or are developed with the cities, because they're the people, it's their job to run the city. It's not the university's job to do that. So we want to make sure we have programs that are consistent with the interests of the cities. And as I mentioned, we are looking at a range of types of campuses, so not just university campuses, but corporate, nonprofit, and government campuses. We're focusing geographically on the Cascadia region of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and in particular, the 3 metro areas of Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about why we've chosen this particular set of locations. some of the issues that we're dealing with, I mentioned earlier on, like interoperability and data ownership or data sovereignty, and also replicability. So these are kind of technical questions that we're addressing. But then we also have some research questions that we're looking at. And because we're at Portland State University, which is particularly good at social science and policy issues, we're trying to incorporate those into much of the research that we do. We have a set of research topics and applications that we're starting with. It's largely opportunistic. So we have some expertise at Portland State or at University of British Columbia that we can take advantage of. And so the three areas that we're focusing on initially are accessibility for people who have disabilities or have trouble getting around in a city, and how can technology help address those issues. Resilience, so how do we prepare cities for threats from natural disasters or terrorism or pandemics, and how do we help the cities recover? How can technology help with all of those things? And then the third area that we're focusing on is public education. So how do we educate the public about all of these technological opportunities, and how do we get their feedback? So we have a number of large companies that we're involved with in one way or another, and several of them are listed here. I'll talk a little bit about Rogers. So Rogers is probably the one most of you are not familiar with. That's one of the major telecommunications companies in Canada. It's kind of the AT&T equivalent across the border. And they have a very active collaboration with University of British Columbia, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these are the big companies. And part of the reason to engage with the big companies is that they can make some investments, some sizable investments on these campuses that then allow the innovations that might come from the startups to work more effectively. We're actually in negotiations this week with Cisco for a pretty major deployment on the PSU campus, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we're also working with a number of startup companies and smaller organizations, and a number of them are shown on this slide. And I'll give some examples of this in a minute. But one of the things to say is these are all independently developed. So as opposed to having Google or Microsoft or Verizon come in and say, we're going to do everything for you, each of these companies or organizations has a particular piece of the smart city puzzle that they're trying to solve. And one of the things that the Digital City Testbed Center is trying to do is bringing groups of these companies together and saying, all right, you are an expert at how to help a blind person work around the city, or you're somebody who works with Wi-Fi systems to help people navigate. What happens if we combine what you're doing? Normally, these companies would not be talking to each other because basically they're trying to survive. But one of the things that we can do with the Digital City Testbed Center is convene them. And we've had some really fascinating discussions that are leading to some quite interesting outcomes. So part of what we're trying to do with the DCTC is have locations on campuses where we co-locate a number of different applications. So this is a schematic of the PSU campus. Many of you would normally be in the engineering building, which is down here in the lower right where it says indoor air quality, and the park blocks are this green area here. So some of the topics that I mentioned before are listed on the left, and these are some of the problems that these companies are working on that we would like to address in a portion of the campus, in this case, the PSU campus. And so we can take a number of those companies that I showed you a minute ago and display those on this map and see how they might be co-located on the campus. Another example is at the University of British Columbia. They have a test bed, which I'll show you in the next slide, called the Aurora Connected Vehicle Test Bed. And this slide shows 9 of the companies that are working at that test bed in large part through the work of the Digital City Testbed Center. So one of the opportunities that I have from having a position at UBC as well as one at PSU is that we can try things on multiple campuses. And so what Aurora does is it focuses on intersections on the UBC campus And on the light poles, like you see schematically here, they have a whole set of instruments that they can put on the light poles or on other infrastructure to carefully monitor what's going on in that location. And on this map, this is a map of the UBC campus, and you see these red and pink circles. The circles are intersections where there either are instruments installed already, so there are 6 of them that are dark red, and then a number of others that are planned. And so what we've done is, and I'll give you an example in a minute, we've taken some instruments. We had a deployment that we were planning to do at PSU, but because PSU is embedded in the city of Portland, we had difficulty getting permission from the Portland Bureau of Transportation to deploy the instruments on the light poles that the city of Portland maintains on the PSU campus. But we then said, well, what about putting them at UBC? So we actually shipped the 4 instruments up to UBC, and this was right before the coronavirus hit. So they're sitting in a colleague's lab right now, but they're planning to install these in the next 3 weeks. And so anyway, so there are lots of opportunities that we're taking advantage of here, in part because the Aurora testbed has been going for about 5 years, while the PSU testbed is much newer. So let me give you a couple of examples of the companies we're working with and what they do. One of the companies is called Numina. Numina is a startup out of Brooklyn, New York. And in the center image here, this is a light pole, or actually I think it's a parking sign. And you see this dark blue object here. This is the Numina instrument. And it has a camera, a video camera, that looks at an intersection. And so one might say, well, that's kind of disturbing. If they can monitor what's going on, if they can see license plates and they can see people walking around, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. But what Numina does is they are very focused on these privacy issues. And so there are no images that come out of the Numina hardware. What comes out are these tracks that you can see on the left. So red is pedestrians, and yellow is cars, and blue is bicycles, and green is buses. And so there's no real privacy issue here, but you get very useful information. The specific application that we were interested in with Numina was what happens when cars interact with bicycles or pedestrians. Now we know when they interact by anything other than honking or waving at somebody, it's not a good outcome usually for the pedestrian or the cyclist. And if a bicyclist or a pedestrian is hit by a vehicle, we have good data about that because there's usually a police report. But if somebody is almost hit by a vehicle, we don't really know how often that happens. So the reason we were interested initially in deploying Numina was to see how many near misses are there. And that then gives us a much better sense of how big a problem this is. So this is kind of a unique solution that Numina can provide. Numina uses video monitoring, so it works well in good weather and in the daytime. At night, or in the fog or rain or snow, it doesn't work so well. So there's another company called Blue City Technology. It's not shown here, but Blue City does the same kind of thing that Numina does, but it uses LiDAR, which is a different technology. LiDAR can work in the rain, in the dark, in the fog, and so that's a complementary technology. Now, Numina and Blue City had not talked to each other before we brought them together a month ago, but now we're going to put both of their instruments on the University of British Columbia campus and see the conditions under which one works better than the other, and what kinds of things can you detect if you combine visual and LiDAR remote sensing of intersections. Second third company I want to talk to you about is called Access Map. So Access Map came out of the University of Washington's Computer Science Department. And what Access Map does, or what it provides you with, is seen on the left. This is like a Google map of downtown Seattle. And for those of you who have been in Seattle, or if you look on the slide on the photo on the right, downtown Seattle is very steep. If you're trying to get around downtown Seattle in a wheelchair, or if you use a cane, or if you have other mobility challenges, you may only be able to use or to navigate on slopes that are, let's say, 3 degrees. Anything more than that, you can't get around. What Access Map does is to show you how you would get from point A to point B without ever having to go on a slope that's steeper than what you're comfortable with. Now, this may be a much more circuitous route, as you see on the left. The blue line is getting you from the first point to the second point, but it will avoid having to go up or down very steep slopes. In some cases, this involves going into a building on one floor, riding an elevator, and coming out on the next. This is a very useful technology for that population. It's been deployed in Seattle and a few other cities, also on the University of Washington campus. We're now looking to deploy it at Portland State, where there's a pretty significant slope up to the south, and also on the University of British Columbia campus. Another set of applications, which I mentioned before, help visually impaired pedestrians to navigate their way around the city or through an airport or through a subway system. And there are a number of different technologies that can do this. Some of them provide audio feedback to the individual through an earpiece. Others provide tactile information. So if a blind person or a visually impaired person is using a cane to find their way around, there's an instrument that you can put on the bottom of the cane that can then interact with a particular kind of paint called Smart Paint. And if you put the Smart Paint in an intersection, say in a crosswalk, the blind person's cane will vibrate when it goes outside of the intersection. So we're looking at a number of these kinds of quite interesting innovations as part of our activity. And the main reason that I mentioned that the Portland International Airport is part of our program is because that airport has been a real pioneer in trying lots of technologies, particularly for people with disabilities. Oops, one more. So the next application is with a company called Sensible Building Science. And what Sensible does, this is a little bit complicated. So it takes advantage of the fact that many buildings, particularly university buildings, have Wi-Fi in them. The Wi-Fi is commonly provided by Cisco, and Cisco routers are how many people obtain their Wi-Fi connectivity. Cisco routers have a particular characteristic where they are counting how many devices are pinging them at any given moment, and they know where those locations are. So just by having a Cisco Wi-Fi system in a building or on a campus, we are also getting information about where people are at any given moment. So it's very temporally well-resolved information. Sensible Building Science, which is a startup that came out of University of British Columbia, takes that occupancy data and links it to heating, cooling, and lighting systems in buildings. And so what they can do is adjust the lighting and the heating and the cooling based on how many people are in a given location. This ends up being quite a helpful thing for building managers to know how to keep the condition of the air optimum for the people who are there, but also to turn it off or turn it down when there's nobody there. And it can be sizable financial and energy savings. So at UBC, where they've deployed this system for the last couple of years, individual buildings can save anywhere from 5 to 20% of their energy bill by using this. But there's another application which we're exploring right now with Cisco, and this is quite exciting. This is, if we're thinking about not being on Zoom all the time, but actually going back to campus, one of the concerns is when we get back to the campus, we don't want to be exposed to the coronavirus. And one of the ways to reduce the exposure is to flush a lot more air through the buildings. Well, you can do that, but that's also quite expensive. And universities like Portland State are under significant financial pressure right now, in part because of coronavirus. And so if there was a way to get more air to flow through in a more economical way, that could be quite useful. So what we're proposing to Cisco is that the PSU campus be the first test bed to pilot this kind of an application for recovery and reoccupation of campus buildings following the COVID-19 pandemic. The last technology that I'm going to talk about is one that has the name that most people like the most. This is Hello Lamppost. So Hello Lamppost is a British startup. And what Hello Lamppost does is allows people to send a text message or a Facebook message to an object in the city, and that object will respond to your message. So here you see on the left a manhole cover, in the middle a garbage receptacle, on the right a light pole. And in each case, you can send a text message to those objects, and just first you'll say hello, whatever it is, garbage can or light pole, and it will respond, and then it will engage you in a conversation. Now this conversation is based in part on dialogue that has been set up ahead of time by the company or by the client, or the city in this case. But it also involves some artificial intelligence. So based in part on what others have said, you might get a question like the garbage can might say, I've noticed that off on the left, there's a park and a lot of people have been playing Frisbee with their dogs, or somebody has been playing Frisbee with their dog. Is that still going on? Or something like that. So that's the generic version of Hello Lamppost. But what we're interested in is to use it as an information delivery and collection platform. So in the questions that Hello Lamppost asks to people and the responses that it gives, we can find out what people's attitudes are about different things. So we could say, did you know that there is a camera on this pole that is monitoring traffic? Does that bother you? Do you feel comfortable with that? What would you like to see to be more comfortable with that, or something along those lines? All of that information is then collected and provided to the client that has brought in the Hello Lamppost. And so Hello Lamppost is currently deployed, again, at University of British Columbia. Digital City Testbed Center set up that relationship. And we're also looking at deploying at the Oregon Zoo so that people can interact with the animals or learn about the animals in a similar way. So mindful of time, the last thing I wanted to talk about is just how do we scale up from one intersection or one campus to what's happening at a city at large or even a region. So there we can deploy technology at lots of different scales, at an individual household or a block, at a neighborhood or campus, at a city, across the city as a whole, or at a whole metro region, or even at multiple metro regions. As we move from one scale down to the next scale, or down in the diagram to larger scales, the impact is potentially greater, but it becomes more and more difficult to actually pull that off. So we've been looking at this question, and I want to just show a couple of slides. This is an aerial view of downtown Portland right here. Here's the PSU campus on the left, which is one of our test beds. And then the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry is over here on the right. And then, so we've had these two test beds, which I've talked about already. But if we wanted to try expanding some of these deployments to something larger without going to the city as a whole, just next to the OMSI site, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, is something called the Central East Side Industrial Preserve. So this is a much larger area. OMSI is 18 acres. The Central East Side is about 600 acres. This is about 100 different buildings with different owners and different companies, but it is part of an association. And so we're now talking to them about taking some of our deployments and scaling them up, particularly the one with Cisco and Sensible Building Science. What if we deployed that technology across 600 acres and 100 buildings? What kind of energy savings might be possible there? And this kind of district scale is present in a number of cities. So an example that a number of us visited right before the pandemic was the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, Seattle, on the east side of Seattle in Bellevue, there's another district called Spring District. And these are all very open to including technology. And so that's the kind of the next step that we're interested in beyond going to individual campuses, is to start looking at these larger districts. And then finally, the largest scale that we're interested in is what could be referred to as the megapolitan scale, where you take a series of adjacent metropolitan areas, so in this case, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, and you link those together. And Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver have a lot of similarities. Now, my research background is in geology. I actually am a volcanologist. I've studied volcanoes for the last 40 years or so. And one of the things that Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver have in common is, and you can see it on the left, each of the cities in the background has a beautiful and active large volcano. So Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, and Mount Baker. But there are a lot of other similarities among Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. They tend to be very green, both physically and politically. They're very socially aware. They're also quite sophisticated from a technological standpoint. They're also geologically quite unstable. So if I were a member of the public, I wouldn't worry too much about the volcanoes in the background, but I would worry about the subduction zone off to our west that can generate very large earthquakes that we need to be concerned with. So looking at this whole region and partnering with the companies that are shown here and the universities that are shown on the right, we have the opportunity to explore and demonstrate what an entire region can do to address some of these kinds of questions. So to wrap up, the Digital City Testbed Center and this Cascadia corridor are places where we can see how cities and universities can partner together to evaluate technology, taking advantage of campuses. And then what we're trying to do is to look at both the positive and negative aspects of putting technology in cities. By co-locating technologies on these campus test beds, we can look for new synergies and new applications. And then finally, by scaling from campus to district to city to metro to megapolitan, we can explore progressively more larger impacts that we might be able to have. So thank you all for being out there in the Zoom land, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Fink, for your presentation. Well, now we're gonna open for Q&A. If anyone have a question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can write your question in a chat. So. There is two questions comes in the chat. So first question, this is from Dr. Daniel. He asking about with that many research groups, then the main problem become integrating, doesn't it?
Great question. Yes, there is a real challenge of integrating the data that comes from all these different applications. That's one of the things that we're looking at. It's also something that cities are looking at, and the city of Portland in particular has been working for a number of years to say, if we have, independent of the Digital City Testbed Center, if we are monitoring traffic and we're monitoring pedestrians and we're also monitoring crime, or we're monitoring air quality, how do we take all of those kinds of information and put them together? So we're partnering with the city of Portland to try to address this. Portland set up something called the Portland Urban Data Lake 2 years ago. And what's one of the best things about the Portland Urban Data Lake is its acronym. Because we're in Portland, it's PUDDLE. But what they did was they worked with Microsoft, Esri, and a couple of other companies to say, if we're going to be collecting data from lots of different sources, how do we make that available to the public and to researchers? So the short answer to your comment was, yes, you're correct. And this is something that's actively being addressed both with the Digital City Testbed Center and in Portland and Vancouver.
Okay. The other question, why using Wi-Fi data rather than cellular data? If somebody has a Wi-Fi device, they probably have a cell phone.
Right. The cell phone information is you would have to get from the cell phone provider. And there are very significant privacy issues associated with tracking where people are with their cell phones using cellular technology. The Wi-Fi information, it's anonymous in the sense that you just have a dot that shows where a person is. And it's not even that accurate. I mean, it's accurate within a few meters. So if you're trying to control an HVAC system, that's adequate. But you don't know, well, this person in this room, after he or she was here, they went in their car and they went to their house or they went to somebody else's place. There's all kinds of issues there. We're working with another company actually called Downtown.ai that is using cell phone navigation data to show how people move around cities. And they have to be very sensitive to these privacy issues. One of the opportunities from working with Rogers up in Vancouver, and I should have mentioned that Rogers has deployed 5G technology on the UBC campus. So it's the first, at least in Canada, it's the first university 5G deployment. And so because Rogers has 40% of the cell phone business in Canada, we have the opportunity to get a lot of very high resolution data, which we can then use to calibrate the Wi-Fi data and the other information that's coming from these other applications. There is also the question of, going back to your original point about cellular, people might turn off their Wi-Fi if they're in a particular location to save their battery, or they might turn off their cellular. And there have been extensive calibration studies that Sensible Building Science has done. And what they find is that the information they get from the Cisco routers is about 90 to 93% accurate. So they're not getting every phone, and some people have 2 devices, but it tends to average out to be quite accurate. Great question though, thank you.
Okay, we have another 2 question or 3 question in the chat, and then also Jill, she has a question. So I'm gonna start with, Chip, he said, hello Lamp Pop, I think the post the technology. He mentioned there is a Simon and graphical song, is something,
yes,
I think.
Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah, and was that intentional, or seems that like a fun inside joke? So
it was very intentional by the people who set it up. So Hello Lamppost was originally created 5 or 6 years ago in the UK in response to a competition that the British government had called the Playful City. And they wanted technologies that could help people have a more positive and enjoyable interaction with their city. So that was why it was set up. And the Simon and Garfunkel song was part of that. Now, those of you who know the song, if you're old enough like I am to remember it, the second part of the title is the 59th Street Bridge song. And I showed a picture of the Brooklyn Navy Yard earlier on. So a group of us were underneath the 59th Street Bridge in early March. And I took some pictures to send to the Hello Lamppost people to say, here, we remember where you came from. Not the most technical question, but I appreciate it anyway.
Okay, we have another question. Is there any work being done to improve the vehicle traffic efficiency?
Yes, so good question. One of the reasons that we wanted to set up Numina on the PSU campus, and the place we were planning to do it, and we still hope to do this, was in front of the engineering building where the food carts are, and then going north down 4th Avenue to where the administration building is. And then the original plan was to go all the way to the Pearl District, so 2 miles along 4th, to monitor traffic there. And that's in part because, for those of you who are on the PSU campus, or normally would be, we have on the west side of campus, on Broadway, there's a bicycle lane that is separated from traffic by a row of parked cars. This is a Scandinavian system, And this is one of the places that Portland tried it out. So for about 5 blocks, if you're on your bike, you're separated from traffic by a row of cars. The city of Portland is planning to expand that greatly, both on Broadway and on 4th in front of the engineering building. And so what we wanted to do with Numina was to monitor bicycle and car traffic before they deployed this protected bikeway, and then afterwards, and to see if there was more traffic, to see what kind of interactions there were. So that would have been one possibility. The other thing is in cities like Portland, where there are concerns about how to reduce traffic downtown, one of the suggestions and one of the things that's been tried in London and Singapore and other places is congestion pricing, where you have a way of monitoring every vehicle that's going into downtown, and you can charge them based on the time of day. So at rush hour, it would be more expensive to go downtown than at night. Or in certain areas, it would be more expensive than in less crowded areas. So one of the challenges with doing that is, how do you actually monitor how people are coming into the city? And we had proposed to the Portland Bureau of Transportation that we would use Numina in 4 locations that have a lot of traffic to see how many vehicles are coming in as a calibration before they did possibly looked at doing this congestion pricing.
Okay, another question. What requirements are there for notifying the public in a largely public space?
Really good question. So it depends on the application. So I mentioned this one before, downtown.ai, which uses navigation data from cell phones. Whenever you use Google Maps on your phone or something like Google Maps, Apple Maps, you have set your settings on your phone to allow that information, your location information, to be recorded by Apple or by Google. And so you've already given that permission. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of apps that you have on your phone that might ask you for that kind of location information, like weather.com or even Amazon might. So for all the cases where you have given permission, then that information can be repurposed. And companies like downtown.ai buy that navigation information that's aggregated by third parties, and then they use it to visualize and show people different things about how people move in cities. So in that case, you've already given the permission, whether you remember it or not, otherwise they couldn't get access to your data. For other applications like Numina, they do the anonymization for you. So they don't really have to get your permission because they're not recording you. They're just showing the movement that you are generating, but they don't know that it's you in any way. For other applications, there needs to be some way to interact with the public. And one of our interests in Hello Lamppost is that that's a way that we could tell the public about these different applications. So if we had, for instance, 3 different applications in front of the engineering building by the food carts, we could have Hello Lamppost there as a way to inform the public and ask the public questions about, are you comfortable with this kind of an application being deployed here, or what would it take for you to be comfortable, or should we take it down?
Okay, now I think, Jill, you can ask your question.
I was wondering if volcanologists are no longer expecting a Mount Hood explosion within the next 50 years. And also, you mentioned that upcoming earthquakes are to be expected. How do you plan for those in terms of setting up all of this electronic infrastructure?
Wow, good questions. In terms of the volcanoes, we don't currently have any applications that are directly related to volcanic eruptions, other than we're working with some companies that monitor air quality. And so if you had an ash eruption of Mount St. Helens, for instance, like in 1980, some of that ash did come into Portland, and we might be able to detect that. There actually are a number of instruments deployed on all of the active volcanoes in the Cascades by the US Geological Survey. That's not normally considered part of SmartCity activity, but it is out there. I didn't mean to imply that Mount Hood isn't going to erupt at some point. It will erupt at some point. I haven't studied it closely enough to know when the next eruption is likely to be. I have a t-shirt though that I got from the US Geological Survey, which has all of the active volcanoes in the Cascades on it. And it has a bar graph next to it showing when all the last eruptions were in the last, I think, 10,000 years. So when I'm wondering about that, I can look at that t-shirt and say, well, the one we really have to worry about is Mount St. Helens, because that's by far the most active. But as far as the earthquake goes, the earthquakes, the very large earthquakes, the magnitude 9s, happen about every 200 to 250 years on average. It's hard to make an average because we don't have that many examples that we can look back at. But from the simplest standpoint, we're overdue for one of those really big earthquakes. And one of the applications that's just to loop back to Digital City Testbed Center, the reason that Hello Lamppost is deployed at the University of British Columbia is because of concerns about the earthquake. Now, this is going to take a minute to explain, but at the UBC campus, like at most campuses, they are worried about what happens after an earthquake and how do we communicate with people? Because if the cell towers go down, how are people going to get information? Or if the power is off? Well, it turns out that at UBC, all of the parking meters have backup power that's good for a couple of days. And so the thought was, well, if the parking meters could communicate with people through their cell phones, that might be useful. But how do you get people to even think about talking to a parking meter, especially if it's for something that may not happen for 50 or 100 years? So they thought, well, let's set up Hello UBC through the parking meters to just start getting people used to this. So the person at UBC who I found who was interested in actually paying the money to deploy Hello Lamppost was the parking services director. And I was actually on a call with him this morning with the CEO of Hello Lamppost, talking about how much they've expanded at UBC from the parking meters to the bookstore, to the residences, and now we want to expand to those intersections that I showed you before. But one of the challenges with any of these deployments that we're facing is finding the first champion of one of these technologies that's willing to either pay for it or say, I could actually use that information. And I would say one of the difficulties for DCTC, for our center, has been getting that permission. So we have a significant budget that we got from the university, and much of that money is being used for these pilot deployments so that they can then be picked up by others who might be willing to put more money in. And just to, not to go on to belabor this, but in the Cisco case that I mentioned before, to do the Cisco application on the PSU campus requires upgrading all of the routers on campus. That would normally cost about $700,000. PSU Office of IT is putting all of their resources right now into Zoom and into making it possible for us to have sessions like this. They don't have a spare $700,000, but Cisco is likely to give us that licensing for free because they see this as an opportunity to try something out at PSU that they can then market all across the United States and Canada. So we see the role of the Digital City Testbed Center as a catalyst to open up some of these opportunities, which we hope will then be taken up by larger, either by city governments or by larger companies that have bigger budgets than we do. Thanks for your question.
We have another question in a chat.
Okay.
They said conjunction pricing tended to be disappropriate affect the low-income people. Houston, for example, had this on the I-10 freeway, and whether the individual be still driving in the HOV land, even the rate were in the maximum. They said also police will be frequently pull over the cars without license or stickers, usually poor or out-of-town people. How would you address your proposal address these things?
Right, right. Thank you for the question. And it touches on a larger question, which I mentioned earlier about just the equity issues of any of these deployments. I think with each example that I gave, one could think about how might this be more accessible for some people who have more resources than others, or how might it be more of a threat to somebody of in a certain neighborhood. And so we're working with faculty at the university who think about these kinds of equity issues, and also with community groups who have a focus on these kinds of concerns to get input from them, because they're the experts, we're not. In the specific case of congestion pricing, that is a concern. And what one has to balance there is the benefits of reduced traffic, which is what congestion pricing is really focused on. So that if you can reduce the traffic, everybody benefits from that. They get to where they're going faster. But if you can't afford the cost, then then you get penalized. And I think there are regulatory ways that one can adjust that and say that, just as on the bus system on TriMet in Portland, if you have financial challenges, you can get a reduced rate to use the bus or the light rail. And there are other policies like that that can be implemented. So I think it's very important to be aware of those and to include those in the planning discussions that are going on. But then there always will be these policy questions of how do you balance certain benefits for the group to certain penalties for subsets, and to make sure that those penalties are evenly and equally distributed based on what people can afford. I will also add, and I think many of you are aware of this, there is congestion pricing in Seattle on the east side of Seattle, going up through Bellevue and Redmond on, I think it's 405. And it is, the question you raise is an important one, because if you're not in the high speed, in the HOV lane, it tends to be quite a bit slower than it probably would be if the HOV lane was open to everybody. Very good question, though.
Thank you so much, John, for wrapping this term up for us and with a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here.
And I wanted to give Tim Anderson the opportunity to give a few announcements for the department, and also say a few words to the students. Tim, are you unmuted?
I think Dr. Anderson, he left. I didn't see his in the participant.
Okay, so then I think I'll take over from him. So I suppose what he wanted to talk about is that ETM will have an open house on June 17th. Of course, it's a virtual open house. It will be a Zoom open house. If you're interested in our programs, our degree options, then join us. And this will be announced on Meetup, like this meeting was as well. So you should find information there. And for everybody who's here for credit, this is the last talk in this series for this term. I'd like to thank absolutely everybody for joining and attending regularly, and I'd particularly like to thank our speakers. I think this was awesome and super interesting, and we had very, very high attendance throughout all talks, which I think speaks to the quality of the speakers, and maybe also that the Zoom format isn't so bad for these kinds of webinars. So thank you all. For the students who need to earn credit, the instructions are on D2L. I will stay on this call for a little longer in case you have specific questions. And for everybody else, I would like to thank you and wish you a very happy summer. And I'd like to give a shout out to Maulud, who did all the tech throughout the entire term. Thank you so much for doing this, Maulud. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay.